Chapter 3, 1959, Flight to India. The celebration of Losar, Tibetan New Year, usually fell in February or March, according to the Western calendar. New Year's Day was followed by Monlam, the annual 2-week prayer festival established by Lama Tsongkhapa in 1409, when monks from all over Tibet gathered together in Lhasa to listen to teachings, debate, watch ritual dancing, and to make full-length prostrations all the way around the Lingkhor, the city's outer circumambulation route that encircled the old city of Lhasa, the Potala, the medical monastery of Chakpuri, and other holy sites. It took a full week to prostrate all the way around the Lingkhor, and Lhasa's householders supported the circumambulating monks by offering tea and food during rest breaks. Tubta Nyeshe had completed the circuit often, declaring that prostrations cleared his mind wonderfully, and the practice greatly increased his understanding of the Dharma. At the start of 1959, Lhasa was filled to overflowing with Tibetan refugees who had fled the Chinese oppression in eastern Tibet in hopes of finding better conditions in the capital. In early March, the Dalai Lama received an invitation from the commanding Chinese military general to attend a theatrical show. At the time, His Holiness was in the middle of sitting for his Geshe Larampa exams, the most rigorous in the Tibetan academic system. The Dalai Lama responded that he was happy to come, but could not set a date until his examinations were completed. On the day of his final examination, the Dalai Lama was questioned by a rotating team of no less than 80 expert scholars before an audience of 20,000 monks crammed into every corner of Lhasa's Jokhang temple. According to everyone present, the Dalai Lama's performance was truly amazing and convinced everyone he was indeed the actual incarnation of Chenrezig, Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. The Chinese commander again extended his invitation, and the date of March 10 was tentatively agreed upon. The performance was to be held at Silingpu, the People's Liberation Army camp close to the Potala. This in itself was mildly suspicious. Subsequently, the general of the Dalai Lama's bodyguard unit was informed by a Chinese brigadier that on this occasion, the Dalai Lama should not be accompanied to the performance by his bodyguards, and that these arrangements should be kept secret from the public. Word of this leaked out, and the young Dalai Lama awoke to the sounds of tumult outside the yellow walls of Norbulenka, his summer palace. Within hours, over 30,000 Tibetans had gathered outside the gates to protect him. They would not be moved. The Dalai Lama agreed not to attend the performance, but still the crowds refused to leave. They had had enough of Chinese, quote, liberation, quote, and feared for the safety of their beloved Dalai Lama, convinced the Chinese military intended to kidnap him, or worse. A week passed, during which messages were exchanged between the Dalai Lama and their increasingly angry Chinese military leaders. On the following Tuesday, March 17th, the Dalai Lama consulted the Nechung oracle. In a divine trance, the oracle shouted, "Go! Go! Tonight!" When darkness fell, Tenzin Gyatso and his family, disguised as Khampa soldiers, quietly slipped out of the Norbalenka in secret and embarked on an arduous 2-week journey by pony and on foot to India and a life in exile. The crowd outside the Norbalenka refused to disperse. Tensions mounted. Chinese forces secretly transported big guns into Lhasa city. At 2 a.m. on March 20, barely 2 days after the escape of the Dalai Lama, the PLA began firing on the Norbalenka, the Potala, Chakpuri Medical College, and Sera Monastery. As Lama Yeshe himself said, in that year, the Chinese kindly told us it was time to leave Tibet and meet the outside world. Quote, every day it became more and more obvious what the Chinese were doing, said Lama Yeshe. Then, suddenly that night, we woke up in shock. Wow! Something was happening. We looked out on Lhasa, and it was flashing with gunfire. Incredible! Quote, the night of March 20, 1959, was one of continuous noise and terror for the inhabitants of Lhasa and Sera Monastery. Around 8 a.m., Thubten Yeshe went around to Kamlung Rinpoche's house to see his teacher, Geshe Sopa. Kamlung Rinpoche, then 16 years old, stood gazing out of the window in Geshe Sopa's room. Quote, from there I could see the Potala and the summer palace. I told them I could see the summer palace being destroyed. Thubten Yeshe was really upset, and Geshe was having a serious conversation with him, quote, said Kamlung Rinpoche. When word reached Sera that the Dalai Lama had fled the city, Geshe Sopa decided to pack up and make his way to the Sera J communal retreat house at Penpo. Because of the constant shelling, however, he was unable to leave. It was still early in the morning, said Geshe Sopa. We were completely confused and didn't know what to do. Thubten Yeshe was crying, asking what we should do, but I had no advice for him then. So Thubten Yeshe went to see his uncle, Losang Tsultrim, who told him, now this is serious war. You have to make up your mind and run to the mountains. So take some money and go, now. Over at Drepung Monastery, things were just as bad. I lived just behind the palace at the center of Drepung, said Gelek Rinpoche. There was one single Tibetan soldier on duty there who was able to communicate with the monks of Chakpuri Medical College using mirrors. I sent my servant to him to find out what was going on. The message came back by mirror that the Chinese were taking over Lhasa. Next I asked what was happening at the Potala, but the reply was, we have no time to look. Now they are coming into Chakpuri. Then I went around to the various shrines at Drepung and made my goodbyes. That mirror message may well have been the very last to come from Chakpuri Medical College on Iron Mountain, which was completely destroyed soon afterward. Late in the afternoon of that terrible day, a group of around 100 monks from Sera took their lives into their hands and walked the 5 or so miles across the open plain from Sera to the Potala, where they knew some old English single-shot bolt-action rifles were stored. They collected some of these, then turned around and walked back across the naked plain, with Chinese guns firing all around them. The Chinese had cannons that could fire bombs from 1 mile away, Lama Yeshe told his students later. We had nothing. not even big knives. Most monks thought we had no choice but to fight the Chinese if they came into Sera. But I thought that was foolish. I didn't touch one gun, not one knife, because, to me, there was no point. I was just a stupid young monk, but I could understand the power of the Chinese guns. We had no training in fighting. The Chinese soldiers were like the moon, and we were like the earth. They had machine guns. We had our nails. We could do nothing. Tubten Yeshe returned to his room. Bombs were landing 20 yards from my house. Outside, people were being killed. If I had gone outside, I would have been killed too. I could hear explosions, like rain on my roof. The whole house was shaking. I was so scared. Many brave monks tried to do something, but I have no brave mind. I just prayed. Meetings were going on all over Sera, but I didn't get involved in any of these either. The abbots couldn't give any direction. The whole place was in confusion, and the monks just freaked out. Some were thinking we could fight for a month, and then things would turn normal again. But I knew the Chinese were never going to give up. I just sat in my corner and did nothing. At twilight, Tubten Yeshe left his house to visit his friend Jampa Kedrup, who lived in the same Kangtsen. On the way, he ran into his student, Losang Nyima, standing at the Kangtsen gate holding a bag of tsampa and a rifle over his shoulder, ready to flee. Jampa Kedrup was not in his room, so, with the shells falling around him, Tubten Yeshe made his way back to his own house, past collapsing walls and the countless bodies of his fellow monks, like red flowers in the exploding dust. The next section is titled Fleeing Sera. Lama Yeshe said, at around 9 p.m., Jampa Kedrup came to my house. What are you doing? He asked. I told him I was doing nothing, just praying. I couldn't do anything else. Then he told me everyone had left Sera Monastery. Do you want to be the only person left here? He said. I said this couldn't be true. It just couldn't be. Where did they all go? We could hardly hear each other for the noise of the shelling. To my inexperienced mind, when one leaves the monastery, it is for a particular destination. But Jampa Kedrup told me we would leave just for a time and then come back. He told me to go and not to carry anything. 1 month earlier, I had sent a rather heavy message to my mother saying I was feeling a little cold. She had sent me a fantastic blanket and some new socks, but I never used them, not even once. I was not living like the saint, Milarepa, who lived in a cave and had nothing. I had possessions, but when I left, I was barefoot and wearing only my underrobe. I took no food, nothing. First, I wanted to go make pee-pee, but everyone shouted at me to not stop for anything. So I left, just like that. There was no time to call on anyone. Tubten Yeshe's half-brother's rooms were some distance from his. Uncle Losang Tsultrim had already fled, and Nawang Norbu was caught in the middle of the fighting. So in the middle of the night, accompanied only by Jampa Kedrup, Tubten Yeshe left Sera. Lama Yeshe. We walked all night, climbing up toward Penpo Gola. At that point, I knew it was over for us, because 6 months earlier I had seen all this in a very clear dream. It came to me during a puja. I even saw myself walking over this pass with some people. In my dream, I was particularly worried about never seeing my teacher, Losang Dorje Chang, again. He was already over 100 years old. The following morning, I told a friend about this dream. Here it was, happening, now, exactly as I had seen it, and I had not been able to say goodbye to Losang Dorje Chang. All the roads were exactly those that had appeared in my dream, even though in my life I had never seen those roads before. It was dawn when we reached the top of the pass. From there, we looked down and saw the smoking ruins of Lhasa. I said to one friend, "We thought Lhasa was the most holy city in the world, and now it is finished. Now we can only pray." By then, we were a group of about 10 monks together. I was the only one who thought Lhasa was finished. Everyone else said, "What are you saying? Lhasa isn't finished. You don't need to cry. This is just temporary. We'll go back down there tomorrow or the day after." But I felt differently. At that moment, I made the decision to leave Tibet, to go someplace where there was no Chinese army. This was the first independent decision of my life. Of course, I had no idea where to go, because I didn't know anything about continents or geography. I had heard about India from Buddhist history, but it didn't mean anything real to me. India was like space. I had never traveled anywhere, only between Tolung and Sera. But I felt there must be some place on earth that was not occupied by communist China, somewhere I could stay as a monk for the rest of my life. At the top of the Penpo Gola, the monks split up. Tubten Yeshe wanted to go to Tolung to see his family. He gave his friend Jampakadrup a bowl, a mala, and a silver coin. They cried and parted. It would be 23 years before they met again. Four days later, Sera was overrun by the Chinese. The remaining monks were ordered to surrender all arms, documents, and correspondence. Senior monks who had not managed to escape were arrested and imprisoned. Soon afterward, they were all beaten nearly to death at a public meeting, after which, ironically, they were given medical treatment. The monks who remained were forced to study Chinese propaganda. All precious metals, statues, reliquaries, ritual objects, and so on were confiscated. Monastery properties were sold, and any stored grain found by the Chinese confiscated. Tubten Yeshe made for Tolung. There he met up with his uncle, Nawang Norbu, his half-brothers, Dorje Tsering and Punt Sok Tinley, as well as a classmate named Chupul and his brother Tubten Dorje. Chupul had known Tubten Yeshe since they were 6-year-old boys. Together, they called in at the house of Tubten Yeshe's younger sister, Nanka. She gave me clothes and her own shoes, Tubten Yeshe recounted. She cried so much, it broke my heart. Nanka was so young. "Please don't go," she begged us. "Let's go home and see Mother." I had good relationships with all my family, but Nanka and I were especially close. We kissed and cried. I told her we could not go to see Mother, that it wouldn't help Mother, and it wouldn't help me either, because then I would never leave, and that would definitely be disaster for me. That was the most painful moment of my life. Leaving Nanka sobbing at her door, they traveled on to a nearby monastery affiliated with Sawa Kangtsen. The resident Lama said that according to his divinations, it would be safe to leave for India immediately after reciting the praises to the 21 Taras 500 times. Completing the recitations, the monks left just before Chinese soldiers entered the village. Uncle Nawang Norbu had brought some money. He gave the brothers half and kept half himself. By that time, Tubten Yeshe's group had joined with a larger group of 30 monks, some of whom were on horseback. Those in poor health rode the horses, whereas the stronger among them traveled ahead with their only gun, one of the old English rifles they had taken from the Potala. At the top of the Pangla, the pass between Tolung and Penpo, they ran into Pema Wangyal, father of Tubten Yeshe and Dorje Tsereng. Not knowing what was happening, he was on his way to Sera with a loaf of dried meat for his sons. He begged them to stop at the family home, if only for one night. He tried to persuade them by offering to give them some gold earrings at home they could sell, as well as more horses. They explained to him that the other monks could not wait for them, and were they to go home, the entire family ran the risk of severe reprisals from the Chinese. Everyone else walked on, but Phuntsok Tinley stood there holding a horse and talking to his stepfather. Suddenly, Pema Wangyal fell to the ground in a dead faint. His stepson had no choice but to get on his horse and leave. Later that night, the party passed very close to Shinkarla. Phuntsok Tinley, overcome with emotion, had to be forcibly restrained by Tubten Yeshe. My brother Phuntsok Tinley's papa had already left him when he was young. He was so strongly attached to Mama. Intellectually, I can't control him. I can only feel his pain. It was incredibly hard for me not to go and see our Mama, but again I made that decision by myself, he recalled. Jampa Kedrup also came to Tolung to perform pujas for various families. When he arrived, he went looking for Tubten Yeshe. The villagers showed him a robe Tubten Yeshe had left behind, and explained that his friend had departed with the other monks from Tsawakanksen. Jampa Kedrup then called on a distant relative in the district who was regarded as an oracle. She told him his suffering would be worse if he fled, so he stayed. Jampa Kedrup spent the next 20 years in Chinese prisons. Tubten Yeshe and his fellow monks traveled only at night, moving toward Yarlung and the Bhutanese border. During the daylight hours, they hid in the mountains. There were monks running everywhere, he said. No one had any idea where to go. We were lucky. We actually went south, but others went north. It was very cold, and walking all night was hard work. For the first time in my life, I had to take care of myself. Until now, I had always been taken care of by my parents and uncles. Some days later, the monks came across an encampment of the Tibetan guerrilla forces who called themselves Kushigangdruk, which means 4 rivers and 6 ranges. This was a traditional appellation for Kham and Amdo together that the allied Tibetan chieftains used to name the Tibetan guerrilla army. All the other monks in Tubten Yeshe's group decided to join the army, which immediately confiscated their one antiquated gun. Quote, so we were again just the 5 of us together. Phuntsok Tinley, Dorje Tsereng Chopal, his brother Tubten Dorje and me, said Lama Yeshe. Quote, in the local village they used some of Uncle Nawang Norbu's money to buy a horse, and as much food as they could carry. Phuntsok Tinley the tallest and strongest carried the most. The village families gave what they could, recited the praises to the 21 Taras with the monks, and meditated with them. The monks assured them this was surely just a temporary thing, and when Tibet was free they would return and repay them. Then one villager, a friend of one of their teachers, urged the monks to leave immediately because the Chinese were close by. The mountains were full of fleeing hungry people, all hunting for lentils and grasses they could eat and stealing any food they could. Tubten Yeshe became the natural leader of his group. He begged them to keep their vows, warning them that should they resort to looting, the Chinese would see them and shoot. They were constantly afraid. The enemy was never far behind, and the group had to be ready to break camp and leave at a moment's notice. They still traveled mostly by night, as Chinese planes were often seen low overhead during the day, shooting at anything that moved. They ate only at midday in accordance with their monastic vows. In addition to these vows, every monk also has a number of obligatory daily prayers and devotions or commitments. Tubten Yeshe never missed an opportunity to fulfill his daily commitments. Whenever the group stopped for a few days, he sought out a quiet place to meditate, inspiring companions with his calm devotion. After some days, they reached the southern province of Lodrak, home to the great translator Marpa and his disciple, the great saint Milarepa. It was here that in the 11th century, Milarepa built a 9-story tower to purify his many negative actions and prove his devotion to his guru Marpa. Tubten Yeshe disappeared into one of the local caves and remained there for some time. One day, while he slept, he dreamed of arriving at a new place and seeing an unusual-looking man on a white horse. This dream filled him with confidence. This was timely, as he and his companions were now traveling through deep snow and were very hungry. We built fires in a circle around us to try and keep warm, even though by doing this we risked attracting attention, explained Chapel. The next section is called The Bhutanese Border. About a month after leaving Sera, they finally reached the high, snow-capped mountains on the Bhutanese border. There was only one very narrow road, said Lama Yeshe. Thousands and thousands of people were on the road, and many people and animals fell down and died right there. I had never walked all day in snow before. It was so shocking. I was young and had good shoes, but I remember the sun's glare on the snow was very hard on my eyes. Bhutanese soldiers were stationed along the border with instructions to stop the Tibetans from entering their country. Quote, everybody was in total panic, totally paranoid. The Bhutanese government had sent men with guns to kick us back into Tibet. We knew what that meant, and we were terrified, said Lama Yeshe. Quote, it was all the more agonizing because the traumatized refugees believed they had finally reached safety, but now they faced fresh trials. Thousands of them found themselves stranded on an inhospitable mountain, with no food, wood, or shelter in sight. Tubten Yeshe's group had their one cooking pot stolen. Among the crowds were the 27-year-old Sakya master, Jigdal Dagchen, Sakya Rinpoche, and his party, including his brother, Sakya Trinley Rinpoche. Both Dagchen Rinpoche and his brother were high lamas of the Sakya lineage, and originally from southwestern Tibet. More recently, they had spent a number of years in eastern Tibet, studying with great Buddhist masters, giving extensive teachings, and establishing Buddhist colleges. At the time of the uprising, they had all been in Lhasa for the Losar celebrations and the Monlam prayer festival. When it was decided that the Dalai Lama would flee the Norbalinka in secret, Dagchen Rinpoche was told there was a place for him in the retinue, but his family could not join the group. Like many Sakya Lamas, he was married. He told the Dalai Lama he could not leave without his family, as they needed his protection. So, the day after the Dalai Lama fled, the Sakya brothers and their families escaped to Sera, and then made their way south. Like most fleeing Tibetans, they had no precise idea of where they were going until they ended up at the Bhutanese border. Tibetans had lived in this region for centuries. The Bhutanese themselves had strong Sakya connections, and the guards, aware of the identities of these two high-ranking monks, supplied them with rice, vegetables, and other necessities. These guards even requested long-life initiations from Jigdal Dachen Rinpoche and Dezsung Rinpoche, who was also a part of the same group. Tubten Yeshe felt drawn to the Sakya Lamas and made several tea offerings to them, a gesture that did not please Trinley Rinpoche's attendant, who believed he should be the only person to perform this task. But Trinley Rinpoche also felt drawn to Tubten Yeshe and thought it delightful that a Gelugpa monk should show such courtesies. I always called him Geshe-la, even though he was not a Geshe, just a monk. I told him I thought he was a Geshe-la already, more than a Geshe-la, said Trinley Rinpoche. In return, the Sakyas offered food to Tubten Yeshe, who shared it with his group. Even without their stolen cooking pot, they never starved. Quote, "It was my karma to always have enough food to eat," he said, quote. The next section is called Bhutan, then India. On the afternoon of March 31st, His Holiness the Dalai Lama crossed the Indian border in, as he himself described, quote, "a daze of sickness and weariness and unhappiness deeper than I can express," quote. The Chinese government did their best to portray the situation in Tibet as a minor internal disagreement and attempted to manipulate the Indian government into refusing any aid to the Dalai Lama or the Tibetan people. Nevertheless, the Dalai Lama was welcomed into India and extended all appropriate forms of hospitality. The Dalai Lama and his retinue, family members, and Tibetan government officials who had escaped with him traveled by special train to their designated residence at the former British hill station of Mussoorie in the pine-covered mountains north of New Delhi. 3 weeks later, on April 24th, Prime Minister Nehru serendipitously met with the Dalai Lama for several hours at his new residence, Birla House, in Mussoorie. Although Pandit Nehru was extremely sympathetic and supportive, he also conveyed the reality of the Indian position to the Dalai Lama. India was not going to recognize the Dalai Lama's government in exile as the legitimate Tibetan government. Back on the Bhutanese border, His Eminence Jigdal Dagchen Sakya Rinpoche had brought a radio with him from Lhasa, around which the anxious refugees gathered every night. Although reception was poor, they managed to catch the news that the Dalai Lama had secured sanctuary for his people in India. The Bhutanese government was instructed to allow the Tibetans through to begin a new life as refugees. They had been stranded on that bitterly inhospitable mountain for 2 weeks. Many died there of cold, hunger, exhaustion, and despair. It came as a terrible shock to them that a, quote, cousin, quote, nation had rejected them. By contrast, India was an entirely foreign country. Quote, the border guards suddenly informed us that now we were allowed down into the road, said Lama Yeshe. We were ordered to go straight. First, they divided us into groups. Then the police took us directly into India. Many Tibetan people who had previously settled in Bhutan gathered beside the road, crying for us, giving us tea, food, and clothes, knowing that our Tibet was lost. Quote, Tubten Yeshe and his group joined the Sakya Lamas. Dogchen Rinpoche liked to travel fast, which left Trinley Rinpoche no time to finish his daily prayers. He had to complete them during rest stops each afternoon. Tubten Yeshe and his new friend Trinley Rinpoche often sat together, telling stories and having a grand time. Sometimes Tubten Yeshe's group pushed ahead, set up camp, and had tea ready when the Sakya Lamas arrived. During one of their chats, Trinley Rinpoche told Tubten Yeshe he had enough money for them to travel to India, and then, when Tibet was free again, to return there together. Whichever way we go, we can go together, he told Tubten Yeshe. That Tibet would soon be free again was taken for granted. The Bhutanese army continued to move the Tibetans along. When they reached a particular junction in the road, the prominent Tibetans were permitted to travel down the proper road with food and protection. The others were ordered to make their own way through a wild jungle, which was clearly a perilous journey. Trinley Rinpoche told his brother he wanted to travel through the jungle with Tubten Yeshe. I liked the jungle. I wanted to see the animals there. My brother said it was too dangerous for me, but I told him that if a snake were to bite or even kill me, I would be happy. Or if a tiger were to bite me, I would be happy too. My servant asked me if I was really sure about this, and I told him I was. Because he trusted me, he came with me. So, my brother took the high road, and I went on the bad road with Geshe-la, said Trinley Rinpoche. In the jungle, I saw many snakes and scary bugs. We could hear tigers. I didn't even know what a tiger was. There were millions and millions of mosquitoes and leeches. The forest growth was so thick we couldn't see the sky. When we stopped, my servant built me a beautiful little house of big leaves. We always stopped in the best places with the best views, and Geshe-la cooked delicious tea for us. Altogether, our group was made up of about 30 people. Everyone was scared. They asked me if it was dangerous, but I told them not to worry. So they then told each other, if Trinley Rinpoche says it's okay, it's okay. Then it's okay. Geshe-la and I were the same age, 25. The others were a few years younger than we were, so we had no problem traveling fast because we were young and proud. Finally, when we reached the top of one big hill, we could see the sun rising in India. Such a big red sun coming from under the ground. For about 20 minutes, we had never seen a sunrise like that. In Tibet, it looks different. Then we came to a place everyone said was very dangerous. We saw 3 cobras together and other snakes that were 30 feet long. One monk touched a beautiful flower, and the next day his hand had no feeling. I'm not sure that I like the jungle. It's too dark. Too many leaves. Their Bhutanese guides told the group no one had traveled this way in nearly 30 years because the jungle was so dangerous. With around 3,000 people moving through in groups, perhaps the noise scared many of the animals away. Trinley Rinpoche's servant was not used to seeing him walk and did not approve. In Tibet, Rinpoches and High Lamas always traveled by horse. Somehow his attendant acquired a pair of buffalo and a cart, and Rinpoche was made to climb in, although he didn't want to. I told him I didn't want 2 buffalo and 1 Indian man to work hard just to carry me, he said. Also, the buffalo made me scared. Such big eyes. I held on so tight my fingernails broke. Then the cart's wheel got stuck in the mud, and it was impossible to push. So after that, Geshe-la and I walked together again, and I was happy. Sometimes we had to walk through tall grass that was higher than our heads. Also, by this time, there were Indian policemen who accompanied us, because by ourselves we had no idea where India was. Sometimes we could hear dogs barking and guess there must be some houses nearby. The whole thing was like a dream to us. On May 16, 15 days after leaving the mountain in Bhutan, the small band of refugees arrived at the Indian border. Trinley Rinpoche and Thubten Yeshe's group were greeted by an Indian army officer on a magnificent white horse, just as in Thubten Yeshe's dream, months before. They were instructed to present themselves at the reception desk in hierarchical order. This put Trinley Rinpoche right at the head of the queue. A geshe from Ladakh, who spoke both Tibetan and Hindi, acted as interpreter. "Who are you?" he asked Trinley Rinpoche. "I am a Sakya," replied Trinley Rinpoche. "Oh, I know who you are," said the Ladakhi geshe, and immediately made 3 prostrations on the ground in front of him. "I am here to interpret you. So what is your name?" "Jigme Nawang Kunga Tinli Tashi Pelzangpo," Trinley Rinpoche began. The interpreter explained to the Indian officer that Trinley Rinpoche had 13 names. "Your name is too long," the soldier told him. "You can only have 3 names." "Please, Rinpoche, would you take off 10 names?" asked the geshe. Thus, the British-trained Indian Army, convinced that foreigners should only have names like Charles John Smith, lopped off thousands of years of Tibetan history with one stroke of the bureaucratic pen. After registering, the Tibetans were fingerprinted, disinfected, and inoculated against smallpox, a disease hitherto unknown to them. Somehow, the border police became convinced that Thubten Yeshe was also a Sakya monk, and he was thus described on his Indian Identification Certificate, the IC, the refugee equivalent of a passport. He was duly issued with permit number 869. By the end of June, 20,000 Tibetans had fled the violent Chinese conquest of their country and come to India. The Tibetans suffered greatly, both those who had elected to remain and fight against Chinese oppression, and those who had escaped. At the request of the Dalai Lama, representatives of the International Commission of Jurists visited Tibet and took statements from witnesses documenting the appalling atrocities being committed there by the Chinese. Entire villages had been obliterated. Hundreds of public executions had been carried out with the express purpose of intimidating the rest of the population, employing methods such as vivisection, crucifixion, beheading, dismemberment, burying alive, dragging the victims behind galloping horses, pushing them from airplanes, or freezing victims to death in icy water. Monks had been forced to shoot their teachers. Children forced to shoot their own parents. Parents compelled to eat their dead children's flesh. Monks and nuns had been forced to copulate and to desecrate sacred objects. Scriptures had been used as toilet paper or to line the soles of shoes. Statues were melted down and made into bullets. Tonka paintings used as floor coverings. In the words of the Commission's initial 1959 report, quote, "On the basis of the available evidence, it would seem difficult to recall a case in which ruthless oppression of man's essential dignity has been more systematically and efficiently carried out." Quote. The fleeing Tibetans experienced different sufferings. They had to cross some of the highest and least accessible mountain passes in the world, with little or no food, shelter, or equipment of any kind. Many starved and died along the way, especially the very old, the weak, and the very young. Some had to engage in running battles across Tibet for months in order to reach the Indian border. One report estimated that of a particular group of 4,000 fleeing Tibetans, only 125 survived and arrived in India. But once in India, their travails did not end. Many Tibetans, finding themselves in a totally alien world, suffered intensely from culture shock. Already debilitated from wounds and starvation, their bodies adjusted badly to the extreme heat, low altitude, and drastically different Indian diet. Moreover, ravaged by endless new bacteria and strange diseases to which they had no natural immunity, thousands died. Like many other refugee peoples, the Tibetans were deeply stunned by grief and depression, many experiencing profound despair and hopelessness.